There we are. Good morning, everybody, and good evening to my friends and colleagues out in Southeast Asia. It's great to be able to present to you this evening, and I'd like to thank USSEC for inviting us to speak. Right, I'm going to introduce the nutrient value calculator, and this is a kind of feed formulation system that we put together in Genesis Feed Technologies. And the idea is that we want to enable buyers and generally non-technical people to look at the nutrient profile of different feed ingredients and understand very quickly, very easily, what the combination of the nutritional value and the economic value is. And we developed this platform actually specifically with soybean meal in mind. We found it has other applications as well. But our basic mission here is to support an important point that Dr. Mateos mentioned, is that we are transitioning our evaluation of soybean meal from the traditional protein approach over to looking at the total nutrient profile and how soybean meals will contribute to the whole of the diet. Now, when we look at soybeans, we've got basically 5 components. The oil is a major one. And when we take that oil out and we have the soybean meal, we have some moisture left, of course. We have crude protein, which is a big interest in the trade. But we need to look more in more detail at the components of the protein. And there's this very interesting area we're looking at now of the soluble starches and the soluble sugars, particularly sucrose, that is present in the soybean meal. And we are discovering more and more that this is a differentiating factor of soybean meals in practice around the world. Now, as we do this evaluation, we're going to present to you a selection of what we're doing with USSEC in bringing up the price evaluations of soybean meal in different markets around the globe. And I'm going to give you some data that relates to the Americas, that's Gulf origin mainly, Ecuador, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Morocco. Now, this list of countries, they've got a variety of different ingredient situations and prices. There are some tariffs involved in changing the market prices within the country. And so they present an interesting spectrum of situations where different regions and different countries will come up with a different economic value for comparing soybean meals. As we move around the world and we're evaluating our materials, we're evaluating them in the context of the local feeds. And I'm going to be looking at broiler and layer feeds mainly with you today, but every country we deal with has their own methodology of making a broiler feed. So Indonesia grows a small bird, they have very high protein starters. Malaysia grows a larger bird, they have higher energy and grower feeds in particular. And the balance of the nutrients they will require in the growth cycle are quite different. So we do look at individual regions and consider the feeds that they need to make. And lastly, of course, we were indebted to Dr. Mateos and his team for the updated soybean meal nutrient values that go into this study as we look at the main suppliers, which would be Argentina, Brazil, US, and India. Oh, there we go. Next one. Okay, so as we look at, it's just a table for a reference. If you look at the handout, these are the regional prices that we've used in the different areas. Looking at corn, for example, the Americas $177 per metric ton. Ecuador, because of tariffs and government controls, very much higher, 380. And this is the kind of thing that gives us a different perspective on the value of the soybean meals as we move around the world. Indonesia too has some restrictions on imports, or big restrictions on imports of corn, so they have a relatively high price. Nearby in Malaysia, the price of corn is much lower. It's only about $35 more expensive than the US price. Morocco, somewhat in between Indonesia and Malaysia. Soybean meal, too, is going to vary in price around the world. And if we look at the amino acids, we don't see so much variation now globally in amino acids, but these two will affect the value of the soybean meal. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the line that says fat there. The value of soybean meal, because soybean meal, as we will see, is an energy contributor in diets. And if fat or energy in a particular region is expensive, that value of the energy in the soybean meal becomes even more apparent. Now, here are some sample formula specs. As I mentioned, in Indonesia, it's a fairly small bird they grow. It's only 1.6 kilos. So we only have two feeds there, a pre-starter feed and a starter feed. We don't need to use a grower or finisher because the bird is too small. Different regions, like in America, would have maybe 4 or 5 different diets, growing to much bigger weights. Ecuador somewhere in the middle. So our nutrient value calculator looks also at the feeding program as it varies from country to country. And here we look at a very quick review of the data that Dr. Mateos has generated for us. We can see that on the crude protein measure, we would probably pick up the Brazilian soybean meal as having the highest crude protein. But I would like to draw your attention to the line that says AME broilers. And we can see here that the US soybean meal has a clear advantage over the other 3 sources in the energy level of the soybean meal. Now, I know you will say to me, Matthew, soybean meal is a protein source. But I would say yes, but the energy is such a valuable thing in these monogastric diets that we have to take into account. Although today I'm going to be talking mainly about poultry diets, I also point out that the ME for swine, we find that the US soybean meal is the best contributor for energy, just like it is in the broiler feed. So this is an advantage that we find in US soybean meal that has continued to be prominent over the years. Part of the reasons, fiber is lower, the sucrose is also higher, and sucrose is the next exciting thing that we're looking at. And here I put together an analysis of the different energy fractions. If we look at the AMEN, which is the traditional ME for poultry, we can see that the US and the Brazilian meals are now somewhat similar. We've seen that the Brazilian soybean meals have increased in their energy content over the years. But when we come to the broiler AME, we can see that relative to the base, the US soybean meal is 104.8% of base, whereas Brazilian soybean meal is only 102.5% of base. And the reason we can see there on the next line is that the sucrose level is close to 7% on average in the soybean meal, as opposed to 5.24 average in the Brazilian meal. And the sucrose is a good contributor to the energy status of the animal. If we look at the swine side, again, we have the same pattern. The Brazilian energy level is slightly lower than base, and the American soybean meal is higher than the base. And down below, just to remind ourselves, I put the 2 equations for the AME for poultry in general, which is the WOPSA from 1989. This does not include any differentiation for the starch and the sugars. The more up-to-date data includes a term in the calculation of the energy for the digestible starch and sugars. And this is where technically we're starting to see a wider appreciation of the value of the soybean meal in terms of its energy. Well, just looking down very quickly, Dr. Mateos has reviewed this data. US soybean meal has the highest lysine, methionine, cysteine, tryptophan as a percent of crude protein. And it's got in the totals the highest lysine, methionine, cysteine, tryptophan on an as-fed basis. So US meal, although I've said a lot about energy, is still a big contributor to the amino acids. When we look at the digestible amino acids, here we go. We find that the major amino acids, that's the lysine, methionine, cysteine, threonine, tryptophan, the American soybean meal is ahead of the game. And on the less well noticed amino acids, isoleucine, valine, arginine, the data is somewhat similar. If anything, now there is a slight edge for the Brazilian soybean meal. But when we look at the total nutrient profile, we get the ideal result. We can't look at these individual nutrients and pick out any one of them as being the determinant of value of the soybean meal. Neither can we rely on any one of these to be the determinant of the value of what we will pay for soybean meal in order to make money out of that purchase. Well, if we look at, I'll skip the digestible amino acids for swine. There we go. Let's see how we put this into the nutrient value calculator. We take this data as above, and this is basically the raw data that we put into a feed formulation system. We then put up the feed tonnages of the representative clients. And when I do these evaluations, I set up economic models of feed mills producing 10,000 tons of their particular brand of poultry or layer. And then we select the soybean meals that we're going to be testing. So in this test run, we're going to be looking at Argentine, Brazilian, US, and Indian sources for the economics. We then will optimize that range of diets in each country under their prices with their local ingredient values and with their diets. And we report the usage of ingredients, the total cost of goods for each of the scenarios that we're looking at, and then we analyze the cost of goods differentials to get the valuation of the soybean meal in practice to determine what we can buy in order to make a profitable trade and grow animals efficiently. So here is the first slide that shows the way we put our solution together. You can see that I've got 4 feeds in this series. This is the Malaysian grow out series. And I've given you an example here of one of the feed specs as it's been optimized inside the model. And just like a least cost system, we've got a minimum amount of corn, a maximum amount of corn, and all the ingredients. We have the price, and it's calculating an amount for us. On the next page, we've got the nutrient side of the least cost calculation. We've got the specification minimum and maximum nutrients and the calculated amounts. So that's the very similar to the inside of a formulation system. And then we look at the usage. Now, when I explain to potential clients who are looking at a soybean meal that is more expensive, they will often say, yes, I understand the quality is better. But please explain to me why it is that if I pay more for a soybean meal, my feed cost comes down. And this is a difficult concept to grasp until we look at the usage of ingredients of the different types we put into the least cost. Now, I've got the 4 different types of soybean meal here, and you can see that the Argentine, Brazilian, Indian, and US soybean meal demand is different for each scenario. And this is a key factor for us, because unless we understand the difference in the volumes, it's difficult for us to perceive where the value is coming from. So as I move from Argentine soybean meal to US soybean meal, notice that I use less. I use about 25 to 30 kilos less, or about 2.5% less US soybean meal compared to Argentine. And as I go from Argentine to US, I use less fat. So these usage reports can show us the dynamics of the substitutions that take place, and they can be across all of the ingredients. The corn will change, the fat will change, the supplemental amino acids will also change. And all of these things come together to give us a holistic value of our soybean meal. And then we come in to do the economic analysis. Now, as I mentioned, we are focusing very much on cost of goods. And if you look at that first column, you can see next to the Argentine soybean meal where it says base, I'm saying that this is the base level of cost of goods per month. And it's around about $45,000 about $2.5 million per month to supply this mill. As I move to the Brazilian soybean meal at the same price in this case, I'm actually saving money. I'm making more money because my cost of goods is dropping. So I have a $37,000 advantage on the table here that I can capture on the Americas. And if I look at the US soybean meal, there is a $46,000 almost differential in using US soybean meal. And this is extra money made by using a higher density ingredient that contributes more to all of the nutrients that matter to me in my feed. We then move on to the next one. And this is Ecuador. We'll go to Indonesia. And we can see the same sort of pattern that as I go from Argentine, I go up to the Brazilian meal. We've got an increase in the yield of about $31,000. If I use Indian soybean meal, I'm going to be losing money on that trade. And then if I use the US soybean meal, I'm going to be making further profits on the trade. And finally, we go to let's look at the Morocco spread. There we go, Morocco spread. I put the Brazilian meal into Morocco, I was making an additional $45,000 per ton. And if I put Indian into Morocco, it will be a $39,000 loss. If I put US soybean meal at the same price into Morocco in a 10,000 ton feed mill, I will yield an additional profit of $69,000. Well, it's this feed cost reduction that gets us excited when we're translating nutrient value into profitability. But let's see if we can understand how we can then evaluate the price we can pay for a particular soybean meal. And it's quite a simple calculation. Let's look at the US line at the bottom. We have got a total cost of goods difference of an advantage of $69,200 per month additional yield in the saving of the cost of goods. There's a usage there of soybean meal of 2,990 tons. And that means I've got a premium of $23 per ton here in Morocco. And that is simply the profit yielded divided by the total usage of soybean meal gives me that premium of $23 per ton. So what does that tell me I can do? That if I put all of these soybean meals in at the same price, in this case of $376 for a test, it means I can go up to $399 and still make money on that trade. So we have what we call a premium spread analysis here, that the nutritional parity price, $399, is the relative value of the soybean meal in this market. And of course, we emphasize that it's going to be different in different places around the world. So I've summarized the results here, make it clearer, and we can see the Americas, Ecuador, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Morocco side by side. And if we look at that relative value line at the bottom, and we'll compare for brevity the Argentine to the US, with Argentine and America at $360 per ton, we have an equivalent value economically of $375.25 per ton. Ecuador is a much higher price market, $435 base for Argentine. We can go as high as $456.26 per ton for US soybean meal and still save money in our feeds, taking into account the full nutrient contributions of the energy, protein, amino acids, and even the minerals. On the table at the bottom, we've got the premiums, the spreads. So in Americas, the spread from Argentine to US, the 15.25 US dollar per ton premium. Ecuador, that value goes up to 21.26. Indonesia, where although the corn price is high, the price of fat is still quite low. The spread is $14.57 per ton. Malaysia is rather in the middle there, 17.78, and Morocco has a high value yield because of the high fat price of $23.15. So as we look across this, we can see that the US in these different markets around the world, under different conditions of tariffs, transport, and availability of different ingredients, US soybean meal has still got a nice healthy economic advantage on its full nutrient profile of between, and on this data, $14.57 per ton up to $23.15 per ton. So with that concluding remark on the value, I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I would welcome any questions. Thank you very much, ladies.